between two hard places. She is rock and she is porous, nesting in the tall grass where you can't see her unless you look. See, this is not a game. See, we harden as we fall. The way these things go, when a storm descends to speak with you, you better listen. Of course you listen, you there still living. The water's bound to get to your boat. Asunintuk, imanga iotak, ataru. When you say the deer swept out to sea was saved, to amass, to deposit, to heap, to hoard, to invest a hill, to lay aside, to lay away, to keep, to deliver, to take, to economize, to redeem, to tender. Ayakuk e take chumi. A marginal propensity to save, a neck, possibly an egg. A stitch in time saves 9. To snatch, one requires the ark, otherwise a flotation device, a Noah. A people saved is a land earned, a reserve. Your hide or theirs, your peach, your pinch, your stone. The key to the human race with the help of the day god killer king know-it-all. Know-it-all. Something very charming and disconcerting reading poems in Emily Dickinson's backyard, I'm finding. A prong or sharp point, such as that on a fork or antler. How about a unicorn horn? Impatient, restless, unrelenting. I would like to dream more often about wonderful beasts than war. Or an ordinary tooth. Mother, plait my hair and send me to the sea. Let me be unseen. Wicked women are allowed as much, and I am tired of being easy prey. How many times have I woke unable to scream, mouth agape and filling with air? I used to, at first, that is, I thought it strange to dream a man I didn't know and know he meant to do me wrong. The dream is a reliable indicator. She is waking up. The dream is a harbinger, often. She is waking up. The dream is a situation increasing. She is waking up. There were tines strewn across the bed. I woke. I woke with my hand in a fist around a bloodied, hollow point. In the current where drowning is beautiful. White breaks first, waves green, then black, shining seas, ships sailing, not sailing, what is still wanting wind? It used to be no man could go against, this weather too will pass. The wind is not a river. And if a puddle at the last gives way to desert, corked bottle, walled city, veiled woman, buried one, were you afraid? Garwak tuknyuk. If air, the conscious element, sometimes breath, sometimes bird. The last few days have been windy, but the current is strong, Nicafor, and it rains all the time. Taminek tangak ater tapet. And sometimes, if I were not afraid, I am a fish with teeth after all. It's always an interesting balancing act, introducing the toddler to culture and having the toddler not interrupt culture. The poems from that second collection were actually written when I was convinced I was not going to have children, And it's so interesting to me now, going back into that book. The poems are obviously very clearly addressed to a daughter figure, and luckily I have a daughter. It would be really weird if I had a son now with all of those poems. But the water imagery continues very much through her name into these next poems. So I suppose really I'm priming that voice, that screaming. We want to encourage it. So disquiet arc. I'm moving into some of my new stuff, same old obsessions. Most funerals get it wrong. Harvest, bloom, root to rope. I'd rather bore myself into a brilliant shell without need of bearing violently forth. But when was the last time you found one unprized without a price? The harvest is in my power, so it is said, but not the blossom. And if roots are to keep me grounded, it's no wonder I'm unmoored. Banks break. What might flowers signify? If you came from the state I'm in, you'd prefer the rock of waves as I do. Poppy petals in the current, ordinary violets, toss in a daffodil, restless in the channel besides. The shoreline harbors toxins, hoards oxygen. This we call blooming. Boom and beam beautifully. It's too much to ask my arc not to break. Not to break me on these steps I open, but tie these ribs at the spine and give them birth. What might they herald? Most funerals get it wrong, to hide the bloat, the blossoming breath, the vessel overcome, cup runneth over. In the right seas, it is right to scuttle, a kindness. Hawking rabbit feet in the age of disbelief. 1. In my dreams when I was young and newly in love, newly bound in love, I hung the birds in churches, before the industrial fans in the ceiling, in the rafters above the old women singing, where they might give the illusion of flight. 2. Don't fill my ark with flightless birds, wings dried tight and bound on their sides. If the bird won't sing, let the old women send their notes on smoke and let blades spin feathers into objects of affection. 3. The dirty birds in the harbor cling to the rigging like baleful Christmas ornaments, like the chuparosa my mother's sister brought for me. 4. On the island, see the nation's birds for what they really are, opportunistic feeders. Like us, they adapt, pluck the crust from the child's hands. 5. White plastic bags flutter treetops. Trash hangs from the nests of black kites. There's something they want to show off. Nests with the most plastic belonging to the strongest the young have not yet learned to covet. We should be proud. Many cling to grim odds, the good news, such as it is. What is left will collect. People only want to see the negative effects of flooding, but there's a lot of green in this climate change to be had. 6. The first ark was not large enough, nearly, and insubstantially monumental, already spit on the divide. The second bought for insurance claims, inevitably to sink into such Kentucky scorched earth. Insert your home state here and hold your breath. 7. Ultimately, suppose it might come to swimming after all, or nothing. Nothing, too, a possibility. I'm just going to read one more poem for you all this evening. Thank you again so much for being here, and looking forward to fabulous Marilyn Nelson next. Red bed fatal. My sex wet and boundless, bounding, unabashed, unashamed, bounding, until I am that which I am open, my open throat. In my throat I open that does dwell and swell, and swell, and sell my body to any good woman, good with these keys in her timbre, in her treble, trembling tremor. I raised on trembling, not these trembling tremors, not this swell, this surging urge, this consuming heat, and heat my wet self inside, my open throat with ship, with coil, with burning bush, with teeth, forever always, with my own rending teeth, tongue forking. If this is my olive branch, my passing into, I'll be damned, I will be witch, I will be woken, woven, weaving, quaking, I will be rolling pitch, and sure, I will be sure, but I will be tongue too, lips and salt on those sweet lips, those sharp, those pitching, rolling hips, those throws, those open-throated, thirsting, potting, sowing throws. I will be those dark waters heaving, and throw my body to those waves, my body to those throws, my body throw my throat into these waters. Every monumental death, every monumental heave, sow my toes to anchor. I will chart and chart these throws, will throw their thrones into these throws. So help me, Ark, I will be boat and rock and blood and red dot on the morrow, and glad, I will be glad, I will be Gladys. I will teach my young to sink ship in their wake, their raw appeal between two blades, two bones, two ribs tucked under fin. Who says we are less? Who says we are not capable of what these vestigial hands remember, grasping, gasping, gapping these bones, these hips, these bones? We will be glad, Gladys, in our black, white, and red, these waters where we make our bed. Koyana.
In the ideal world, we would be two people in a room, and I would be reading poems to you. You would know me well enough to know that your response really means a lot to me. We don't have that situation, but we're here. And your response does mean a lot to me. So, yeah, I hope you like me. Thank you. Nah. I've been agonizing all day, though, about the choice I made of poems to read, because there was to be an ASL interpreter, but I haven't seen one.
Live captioner. They're typing.
Oh, okay. So I was thinking maybe I could get away with making changes, but I guess I can't. I decided what to read this evening based on what I remember writing during the 3 or 4 year period when I was completely involved in an online discussion group of Emily Dickinson's poems. The group was called M-Web, and it became at least my social life. But more than that, it became my creative life for that period. So I've been trying to remember what I was working on during that period, and I think I narrowed it down to 2 projects. I write book-length projects. My glasses are not good. I write book-length projects, and it always requires me to give a long explanation of the background. If I want to read one poem, I have to place it in the context of a lot of other poems. And so the context I'm going to give you here this evening, because I think I was working on 2 projects during this 3 years. One of them was finishing a biography of George Washington Carver, which occupied me for several years, mostly doing research, and I love that book. But then I also was involved in undergoing a kind of spiritual awakening that had to do with finding again a boy I had met 20 years earlier when we were undergraduates in college. We had a ooh-ha experience at a party. We were introduced, and I held my hand out for him to shake, and he turned my hand over and kissed my hand, and then he kissed my arm up to my shoulder, and then he looked into my eyes and said, "I'll never cease loving you," over and over again, probably 100 times, while I was saying, "Who is this? Is he stoned?" And then I finally decided that I should believe it, so I said, "I'll always love you." We were friends, sort of, we were shy, for about a year, and then we graduated, and he came over, and there were some other people at my apartment, and we were having a good time, and as he turned to go with everybody else, he asked me if I would sleep with him, and I laughed. I was so shocked. I laughed, and he ran away. And I hadn't seen or heard from him in 20 years. And I decided that I should find him, and I found him. He had just completed a 7-year novitiate period in a very strict Benedictine monastery. And I luckily didn't have the fantasy that it was me who sent him into a monastery. Although it was kind of a nice fantasy. It seemed very clear to me that he was always a person waiting for this spiritual search. And, I found him. I found him. I got a grant, a research grant, and went to see him. He lives on an island in the Indian Ocean. It's called Mauritius. And I got a grant and went to Mauritius. And we became really dear friends, although the romance part of it was back in the past. The friendship part of it has blossomed into something really enriching. And I wrote these poems. These are based on my first visit. We've done a lot of traveling together. In the meantime, I'm sorry, I am talking too long. I'll just read some of the poems. These are a portrait of, one other thing I wanted to say is that I was reading Emily Dickinson, and I bought a notebook and started copying out poems which she wrote, which I would like him to read as if they were from me to him. And I filled a whole notebook with these poems and sent it to him. And then a couple of years later, I don't know, I think we were traveling in Africa, and I asked him what he thought of those Dickinson poems, and he said, "Oh yeah, I never got around to reading them because he lives in a hermitage, and my hermitage was robbed, and my library was set on fire." So he never saw these poems, but there are a lot of Emily Dickinson poems that felt to me like poems I might have written to him. So this is the object, the recipient. I'm giving you a portrait of him. He called himself Abba Jacob while we were together. Abba means father, and Jacob means Jacob. This is called Abba Jacob and Miracles. One day, Abba Jacob was praying in a sunbeam by the door to his underground cell. And the brethren came to him to ask him about miracles. One of the elders said, "My mother's spirit came back and turned out all the lights the night we gathered for her wake. Was that a miracle?" Another said, "One spring evening, a white rainbow of mist passed over our heads. Was that a miracle?" They went on like this for several hours. Abba Jacob listened. Then there was silence. "Big deal," said Abba Jacob. "Miracles happen all the time. We're here, aren't we?" Thank you. Thank you. This is called Fish and Floor Dust Bouquet. Abba Jacob hums quietly, negotiating traffic from the airport. White sleeves rolled back from his tanned hands on the wheel. White skirt from belt to barefoot sandals on the pedals. Mama hums too, watching landscapes grow and go. A truck has stopped on the edge of the highway, its load of fish spilled, its driver laughing. Fish on the pavement and grass as laughing men toss silver arcs back into the truck or ride off on mopeds and bicycles with fish on their laps, in baskets, fish under their arms. For a passing moment, the air seems to flash with fish, and happy yells join two old fools humming. They exchange a quick, delighted glance. They are driving to his place, a fieldstone monastery surrounded by wind-rattled cane. The guest house has a new veranda. The well is 20 meters deep. There's a pool with little carp, and 3 sheep now mow weeds near the hidden hermitage. When Mama has seen everything, Abba Jacob walks her to her room and bows outside her door. He says, "I'd planned to have flowers here for you and everything clean and fresh. But I was called away before I finished sweeping, so you have a pile of dust in the middle of the floor." That's much more symbolic, don't you think? Mass is at 5. Mama bows, laughing, and straightens to watch him walk away. She remembers his shoulders. Fish everywhere, fish like sunlight from the afternoon sky. Thank you. This is called Abba Jacob and the Businessman. A businessman heard about Abba Jacob and went to see him about his difficulties with mental prayer. Abba Jacob was planting trees. When the businessman saw him, he said, "Boy, tell me where the cell of Abba Jacob is." Abba Jacob said, "What do you want with him? The man is a fool." "Oh," said the businessman, turning away, "I heard he was holy." Now, this is Abba Jacob and the theologian. Thanking him for spending the entire afternoon and half the dinner hour discussing the various ramifications of the essentially paradoxical nature of faith. The theologian interrupts her first spoonful of lentils to lean forward again and cut off the flow of God. "Reverend Father," she asks, "what is the highest spiritual virtue?" Abba Jacob looks to heaven and groans. "Humor," he says. Not seriously, of course. Abba Jacob and Abba Jacob's aside on hell. Abba Jacob said, "I wonder if souls are unhappy in hell. I rather doubt it. And if they are, they won't admit it, like people in an expensive nightclub, glad-handed by the rich and the beautiful, while the rich and the beautiful hold cold hands to a fire in a dustbin." Signal if you want me to change. Oh no, I can't change. I'm stuck with this. Men in the kitchen. These are all true anecdotes. And at one point, while I was there on this first visit, there was a young man staying in a guest room in the monastery, someone who thought he wanted to be a monk. So this happened. It's called Men in the Kitchen. 1. Abba Jacob said, "I scooped some dying fish from the carp pond this evening. They were a little bit smelly, but I think they're okay. I'm going to cook them for the dogs." 2. Abba Jacob said, "Well, I've buried them and aired the place out. I've heard candles remove odors. I'll light these. I think I'll make an omelet for our supper." Mama said, "How romantic, cooking by candlelight." 3. Abba Jacob said, "Sit in the chair, and I shall demonstrate how we prepare the perfect omelette. First, we warm the pan, then we add a bit of the butter, then we break the eggs." Oh my goodness, what a stench. 4. Abba Jacob said, "Well, I've buried them. At least the windows were already open." Mama said, "I hope you realize this gives women several thousand points." Abba Jacob said, "I let you have them. You've been falling terribly behind." 5. Abba Jacob said, "Thank you for the delicious meal we are about to share, and for meals we have shared and will share, and for meals shared with others we love. Thank you for the perfect meal we shall someday share in full communion, dissolved in you as laughter dissolves in laughter. 6. Abba Jacob said, "Have I ever told you about my ancestor, the corsair? He was so wicked. He once kidnapped his own mother and held her for ransom." Well, let's see. This is called Abba Jacob at Bat. A young visitor wearing an angel's cap sat down cross-legged at Abba Jacob's feet. Abba Jacob said, "That baseball cap reminds me of the man who died in my arms when I was 23. His last words were, 'Put out the light.'" Why baseball caps? Abba Jacob rose and took his guest's cap, snapped it twice against his forearm, put it on, and straightened the peak. He said, "Because they remind us to live." I just read a couple more, I think. This is called the simple wisdom. Abba Jacob said there's a big difference between the mentalities of magic and of alliance. People who spend their lives searching for God have a magical mentality. They need a sign, a proof, a puff of smoke, an irrefutable miracle. People who have an alliance mentality know God by loving. So I think just maybe 3 more. Abba Jacob gets down. I should interrupt myself. While I was there visiting him, he was reading a book of apothegms of the Desert Fathers. Apothegms is spelled A-P-O-T-H-E-G-M. These are sayings of the Desert Fathers, who were a generation of Christian hermits who lived in the deserts in Egypt and Syria. They were hermits, but they lived in communities of hermits. They didn't live together. They lived on their own. And then they did things like eat 1 bean a day. And their apothegms are funny. And so since he was reading them at the time, he was reading me these funny stories about the Desert Fathers. So that's why they're all called Abba Somebody Does Something. This is called Abba Jacob Gets Down. Abba Jacob said, "There was once a desert father who had a bad novice. One day, the novice died and went to hell. That night, the Abba went into ecstasy. He had a vision of his novice surrounded by fire. 'My son,' he said, 'I pity you for being there.' 'That's all right, Father,' the novice replied. 'I'm sitting on 3 bishops.'" Okay, so I said I would read just a couple more, and I will. Okay, I'll read two more. This is called Leaving the Hospice. Abba Jacob said, "It's amazing. The old nun has been resurrected. It was so clear last night that she was ready to die. I hope her doctors haven't made her labor more difficult. We all have to die, you know, when we've reached the end of our lives. The lucky prepare themselves, clean house, so to speak, make peace. Our clinging to the old like selfish children afraid to be left alone in the dark must make leave-taking arduous. Does our medicine prolong their living or their dying? What awaits is welcome, purer than true love's first kiss." And I'll just read one more. Yeah. This is called May Your Love Convert Lucifer. Oh, it has an epigraph. Even the devil has some good in him. That's from St. Anthony. Abba Jacob said, "I pray for Lucifer. I rather like him, you know. My moral theology professor once said, 'God hates Satan.' I said, 'I hope that's not true. If God hates Satan, God must hate me too, because I am a sinner. But God loves me. If the devil has anything to do with half the hate and evil that goes on in the world, as it seems he does, then he is a terrifying being. On the other hand, his power was broken by Christ's great gifts of love and life. And he was created good and beautiful, and God still loves him. Why then should we hate him? So I pray for him once in a while when I think of it. I'll bet it makes him mad as hell." Thank you. Thank you. We just moved over. Where are we going to be? Thank you for your patience.
So Abby goes there. Terry, this will be your mic.
So will we have a Q&A after, or, okay, and will you handle that? Or will she-
Yes.
Okay, great. So there are mics up here. Okay. Wow.
Am I sitting on this?
Did you get a mic?
I think so.
Brooke, I think that one's from Marilyn. There was, yeah. So, yeah. So we've each got our own. Oh my God, this is wonderful. Wow. Well, are we on? No? Now? Okay, how's that? Well, thank you, Brooke and Jane, for inviting me, and my God, I'm really just very amazed and grateful to be here and to be able to have a conversation with you both about these fabulous poems and your lives as poets and what are we doing in Dickinson land. And so thank you for such a wide-ranging and beautiful, loving reading. When we first met, Brooke convened the three of us to get acquainted via Zoom. And so I believe, Abby, you brought up Susan Howe's Emily Dickinson, my Emily Dickinson. So you kind of sent me back to that. So I thought I would start out questions with that kind of slant, so to speak. Because I went back to my Emily Dickinson and discovered that Susan Howe had actually borrowed from Emily Dickinson's letter, and I have a little bit of an excerpt here when she says, my George Eliot. And so Susan Howe is echoing Dickinson in choosing that title for that fabulous book. And so this is what she quoted early on in the book, and this is from one of Dickinson's letters. It's when Dickinson discovers that George Eliot has died. And Dickinson just was a huge follower, fan of Eliot. She had Eliot's picture in her bedroom. She refers to her in a lot of letters. Her niece remembers her talking about one of Eliot's characters. So this is what Dickinson wrote. The look of the words as they lay in the print I shall never forget. Not their face in the casket could have had the eternity to me. Now, my George Eliot, the gift of belief which her greatness denied her. And Howe goes on to say how Dickinson took from Eliot her iconoclastic nature, her agnosticism, her defiance of Victorian conventions. So I just thought I would echo that and see if you would have a literary forebear that you would attach the pronoun my to. Who would be? And you can take Dickinson if you want. She's Susan Howe took her, but of course, but.
Terry, would you mind reading
The letter?
passage?
Yeah, okay. The look of the words as they lay in the print I shall never forget. Not their face in the casket could have had the eternity to me. Now, comma, my George Eliot, the gift of belief which her greatness denied her.
Well, I can certainly answer in terms of the idea of the poet that we follow, the sort of poet that we claim as our own. In terms of literary ancestors, I certainly have favorites and literary ancestors, among them Alice Notley and Sappho and Emily Dickinson, although I've certainly read more of her letters than her poems, and I've come to Emily more through her letters than her poems. But when I'm thinking of my writing in terms of relationships, I also often think of my ancestors and my community as also involved in that space of writing, and thinking of the ways in which my own poems become a space to inhabit and an invitation to inhabit, but they also become an opportunity. And the poems that I read that I love, the ones that I love the most are those poems that invite me into them and provide space for me, not necessarily with answers, but space to dwell a bit. And I think that's what I love the most in poems is the language and the correspondence with ancestors. And the figure Nicephore was one of my great-grandfather's siblings who died very young. My daughter's name is Adrian, after another one of his siblings who died in Alaska. And so the poems become this space of presence. And I think that's something that I find kinship with Emily Dickinson when I think about her work and I think about what it is we're reading with her today. And I'm so glad you didn't follow up with any pressing quizzical questions on that Susan Howe book, because I'm still in it trying to, from an academic standpoint, wrap my head around
I only got
it.
so far. I got about as far as Jonathan Edwards, but yeah. So
Who's your my?
who's your?
I was reminded, I have a book that is called My...
I think they want the mic for the...
Oh, okay. I feel like I should burst into song. I have a book that's called My Seneca Village. The title was given to it's a collection of poems about Seneca Village in Manhattan that existed for about 50 years in the middle of the 19th century as a black village in Manhattan. And I just invented characters. I gave them names from the census records and just made it my village. And I've been trying to think of whether I have ever had a poet in that way. Maybe, I don't know, Rilke. I interviewed for a job for an academic position once years ago, and somebody on the committee asked who I would want to be like as a poet, and I said Rilke. They must have thought I was crazy. But there are poets I can't read because reading one line or one poem sends me into such ecstasy. I can't go on any further. I have to sit and think about it for a while. And I would say that the period I spent with Dickinson was like that. I could only bear to read 1 or 2 poems a week. That was just enough food for the mind and heart to keep me going for a long time. And I'm thinking of other I don't know. I'll stop there with. But my literary loves have been so wide-ranging. I thought, as an undergraduate, I thought I was going to become a medievalist because I had fallen in love with Chaucer, with his body humor. And I have a book which is essentially my Canterbury Tales. It's called Cachoeira Tales, about a trip I made with some friends and members of my family to Brazil, and it's consciously based on my Chaucer. So I don't, that's enough.
That's great. Yeah, well, it's wonderful to think about. I don't know who my literary ancestor might be. I was thinking maybe A. Milne, because I'm doing a lot of reading with my grandson right now. But you did sort of segue into more personal ancestry, which is where I thought this might go, Abby, which was to think about how ancestry in your family stories and your family history figures into your writing. I was thinking about your story about your great-grandfather and how that segued into your you call it documentary poetics, and you're using like historical records and of his having been removed to the Carlisle Indian School, and what that all must be an impetus for you for like recovering and getting past trauma. And I think both of you do, constant witnessing, and your work strives for social justice. I'm thinking of Marilyn, your Bowley Rodeo poems, in terms of the ancestry there. And if anybody doesn't know about it, the Bowley Rodeo is the longest lasting African American rodeo in Bowley, Oklahoma, which was one of the free Oklahoma towns that was established like 125 years ago as a refuge against Jim Crow. So all of that kind of, I know, works into your...
Excuse me, one interruption.
Yes.
And it was my mother's hometown.
Right. Yes, I was going to,
Okay, sorry.
yeah. Because it is very much your ancestry there from that. And I just Googled the Bowley Rodeo the other day, and it's really a lively, wonderful thing. So anyway, I just thought maybe you would talk a bit about the more personal ancestry that feeds your poetry. Or you started talking about that, Abby, but...
Yeah, it's something that became a large impetus in my writing, and it wasn't where I was expecting to necessarily go, but as a poet, but I had spent years writing these scholarship essays, telling my community that if they supported my education, I was going to contribute to the community in these ways of passing stories and involving myself in anthropology and all of the kind of quagmire of that field. And when I got to graduate school and started trying to not just look at the craft of poetry, but what it was I had to say and where the questions lay, I was drawn back to those essays and those promises of giving back to the community. And that is such an integral part of, for myself at least, my Indigenous identity and how I identify and how I am claimed by community is all about the relationships and the responsibilities. And despite the removal of distance, how can I still participate in that community? Despite the distance in history and the rupture of family ties and the sort of settling that my family has done in Pennsylvania, how to maintain these ties and these bonds, and also just missing that family. I think my dad was an only child, and he very much lamented that childhood and has spoken to how lonely he felt as a child, and wanting to reach out to relatives that were alive today, but also in that past, and finding those voices and finding those pockets of community and ways for that to go both ways, right? So for myself also to be able to return to my community without physically being able to relocate to Alaska, how could I also find paths through the stories and through the histories? And it's really been more through correspondence than any sort of imposition of narrative, searching for narrative, but really finding more in the search opportunities to dwell in the silence. Actually, something you said last night that really resonated with me, Marilyn, was that idea of poetry being this space of silence and this space of listening. And I feel that the most I can do in my work is to attempt to listen to these voices and these stories that were largely denied to my family, and deliberately so, and intentionally so. There was malice in that rupture, and so how to get back to this space of listening and how to bring those voices into the work, I think is something for expanding my own family and my own sense of self, but also a way of grounding myself to where we're from, and looking to the future as well, what that might look like to write into a very uncertain future.
May I ask you, Abby, I missed your family is from Alaska, essentially. Mm-hmm. Your father was taken away to the Carlisle Indian School. That was in
my great-grandfather.
Yes.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
So my great-grandfather was taken from his home in the Aleutian Islands of Alaska to the Carlisle Indian School as a teenage boy, and
that was
Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
So
yeah.
So the essentially with him, the family made this.
Yeah, so he never went back.
Migration.
He never went back to Alaska, and he died shortly before my grandfather was born. So there's a lot of speculation and uncertainty as to whether he would have been able to return financially, whether the government would have sent him back, because the mission of Carlisle was to separate them from family, and his immediate family had passed. And so there's a lot of, which is the other driving force of the writing, is there's just so much of the narrative that we don't have. Yeah. But yeah, so he never went back to Alaska, and it was my father's generation that really went digging back for family in Alaska and ways of connecting. and trying to bridge some of those gaps.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I really am interested in whether your great-grandfather's generation and subsequent generations made a connection to the land they were living on in Pennsylvania. Did they buy land? Did they...
He was a very proud homeowner. There's a census, actually. There's a survey. We know very little except what the Carlisle records hold. And he had he was very proud to tell Carlisle that he owned his own home. It had all the modern conveniency in it, was the way he framed it. And he was married to a local Lebanon girl. It was in the papers as Indian marries white girl. It was a big to-do. And yeah, I think that landscape, as much as the ocean landscape, has always haunted my internal visionscape, my image tracks, as much as the ocean has always been prevalent, even as I've lived landlocked. The trees are also, the forests of Pennsylvania are also very prevalent in my sort of personal imagery and in my own relations. It's sort of a source of tension I'm recognizing now as I keep writing about the ocean and flooding and the Aleutian Islands being a very nautical people, and just how much I am actually reliant on trees and woods myself.
Thank you. Really interesting.
Well, I was noticing a lot of, ocean and water and the language kind of flowing in a very musical and watery way in your work, so I can see how that translates. I also took a few questions from something I'd like to sort of give a shout out to, in case you all haven't been aware of it, because the Apple TV Dickinson is being feted at this event, and so I guess several of the actors have been here. And I'm not generally a podcast kind of person, but I have really been enjoying the podcast that was put together. It's called The Slave Is Gone. The podcast is the after show that talks back to Apple TV's Dickinson. And it just seems very timely to put it out here now, and if you haven't watched it, it's really delightful. Jericho Brown and Brene Genet, who goes by the name of Reezy, are the co-hosts, and then they have various poets who are guests for each episode. They only did 10 episodes, one per show of season one. And then they have a historian, Aoife Murray, who wrote the book Made as Muse, and about the impact of servants on Dickinson's language and life. And Aoife Murray's sort of through line of the servants is what kind of fuels a lot of the plot of the Dickinson TV series. So I just, what they do is they kind of dish on what's going on, they gossip about it, they bring in historical references, it's all about poetry, because you're not going to get very far with Jericho Brown without, a lot of poetry happening, and then they have wonderful poets as guests. And Aoife, who calls herself a rogue scholar, she's an artist, and her book is a work of independent research, is on the podcast as a historical footnoter whenever they have historical questions. It's really, really a lot of fun. And Aoife always poses a question to the poets in every episode. That's sort of a ritual thing. They chit-chat about the episode, they share poems, the guest poets read poems, and then Aoife says, question for the poets. So I was going to copy from those questions, because one of them actually kind of echoed what you were saying earlier, Abby, which was when Evie Shockley was the guest poet, the question was, how is Dickinson in your life and work? How do you incorporate Dickinson in your writing, your thinking, however? And Evie Shockley's answer was so interesting because she said, we got all the kind of surreal spaciousness in Dickinson and her the musicality and the wit and everything, that she said, and I wrote it down, Dickinson's language is so memorable, how it fastens in her mind. Edie's rapture with slant rhyme and off-kilter meter, she loves that. The language brings things that writers don't necessarily intend. And Dickinson leaves a lot of room for Black women or women of color to find spaces that Dickinson might not have originally intended. So I sort of picked up what you were saying from the spaciousness and how the poem works with you. So you've already talked a lot about Dickinson, but are there other ways that you can say she's manifest in your work, or you lived with her, Marilyn, so practically, for 4 years, but.
I'm not. I was hoping Abby would.
I'm sorry.
take over. I'm not sure how to approach the question even, except that I refer people interested in writing in verse forms. I refer them to Dickinson and Yeats and William Meredith as poets who expanded the concept and the possibilities available to rhyme. Most people think of rhyme as perfect rhyme, and man, you read 5 pages of Dickinson, and if you think rhyme has to be that way, a perfect rhyme, she just blows the top off of rhyme.
Right.
And I think Yeats does the same, but with less wildness. I mean, Dickinson is so courageous in her experiments. That's all I can think of.
Yeah, that's fine. Sorry.
My answer is not as interesting, but I think the compression is something that draws me to her work. The sort of historical facts of the writings on the envelopes and the scraps of papers, and having the pockets and having things at hand for the moment, and then looking at the works not just as their individual poems, but as an experience. As you mentioned, Marilyn, not being able to really read more than 1 or 2 in a week, and I've similarly had that experience every time I've tried to read Dickinson, is that if you try and read through it like a contemporary poetry collection and read through to the end, you just have to stop. You really can't do the poems justice if you try and deny them that space and the sort of pockets of silence around them. And yet, there's a way in which we know Dickinson was more invested in current events than previously been credited, because of the concentration of work around certain times, the sort of explosion of creativity and productivity around certain historical moments, suggesting that she absolutely was invested and thinking of these things, even if they weren't working directly in the poem. And I'm very interested lately in how those exterior moments work their way into the poem indirectly in those ways, and the way in which the, perhaps not fragmented from Emily's work, but in my own work, the way the fragments accumulate and accrue and begin to speak across those silences and across the page breaks, and in that sort of compressed yet, spaciousness as well.
One additional thing I would like to add, thinking about Evie's question of what Dickinson offers to writers who don't share her ethnic background, is that she shows that everything is there to be grasped and used. And for contemporary writers who, I remember once visiting an MFA program someplace. And the poems they gave me to prepare for my day with them were all self-portraits in front of a mirror. Yeah. What is this? Somebody had given that as an assignment. And I went out at the lunch break and checked out some copies of Scientific American and brought them back and just passed them out and said, open one of these magazines any place, any page, and read one paragraph and write a poem about what you've learned in that paragraph. Okay. That's Dickinson. She's so full of excitement about information and science and places in the other side of the world and names for colors and sounds of. She's just so open to enchantment.
She lets the world in.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm stealing that.
That's a great place to stop, I think, unless the audience has other questions. We were going to have some Q&A, but I just did want to point out, I think it's when Dickinson was published by Mabel and Higginson, I think in I'm Nobody, Who Are You? How dreary to be somebody, how public like a frog, to tell one's name the livelong June to an admiring bog. And I think when they published it livelong day, which would have meant they were using Camptown races and that whole mess. But livelong June is accurate scientifically because June is when the frogs are mating and singing to each other. So anyway.
And it would have mattered to her.
And it would have mattered to her, right. And I remember reading about Bowles coming in and saying something about she'd written about snakes, and he's like, how does she know that? So yeah, that's nice. So thank you guys. This was lovely. Thank you so much. Yeah.
So I'm hoping that, there we go. Yeah, thank you so much. And we do have time for some questions. We will alternate questions with those of you in the audience and our audience online. So do we have anyone here who would like to respond or has something of interest? Let's start with an online question.
So from the folks at home, and there are many, and they are so happy to be here with you and with us. Marilyn Nelson mentioned the importance of silence and attention and listening yesterday. And Abigail Chabitnoy spoke of the space of the poem as not somewhere to get answers, but to ask questions. Can you both talk more about that place of poetry, what it creates, what it makes possible, or how you approach it?
Can I start first, because I do have a kind of a pat response. I'm not quite sure how I got this exercise, but it's a self-meditation, self-hypnosis exercise. Close your eyes, you count 10 breaths, and then you see something. And gosh, the anecdote I want to tell is that I've given this to lots of creative writing classes. Just close your eyes and count, meditate a little bit, and then see something. Just open your eyes and see something. And I think in one of them, I suggested you see, you go down in an elevator from the 10th floor to the basement. You open the elevator door. You take 10 long paces down the hall. You open a door to the left and go into the room. And what do you see? And I told them I was doing this all the time. I'd forgotten about it. I haven't done it in years. I was doing this all the time, the elevator, the 10 steps, and I would get in. And sometimes I would go to the window, and my dragon would be there, and I'd fly off in a dragon, and blah, 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 blah. And it was a great exercise, and I gave this exercise to one group of students and residents at an artist colony. And everybody had a good time with it, except this one woman who's really sour. It didn't work for her, because when she got on the elevator, there was a horse in the elevator, and she spent the whole time trying to push the horse out of the elevator, and so all she had to present to the workshop was this lousy poem about pushing a horse's ass to get it. It was so funny. She didn't think it was a poem at all, but the exercise worked better for her than for anybody else.
Yeah, well, I mean, I would just echo that sounds like it echoes for me, I think, just how I create that space, and it's finding, if it's a mental trick to get yourself to not rush into the poem, or to let yourself settle into the silence, or create this sort of receptive mindset, and for me, it's just become about the atmosphere I create, and when I sit down to write, and trying to be more flexible with that, but also working in the morning, working in the quiet before anyone else in the house is awake, before the dogs are awake, before my editorial critical mind is awake, and just preserving these sort of liminal spaces has been one way that I guess I sort of let myself into a space of uncertainty, and that's what I mean in terms of the poem being a place to ask questions rather than answers, is the poem being a place where we can write into discovery without necessarily the pressure of coming away with any sort of finite definitive knowledge, but just being a sort of room that one can dwell in for a moment, and without these sort of expectations of productivity or anything to show for it or any definitive answers, and it just honestly takes time more than anything. There's no real trick other than, although the meditation sounds like a great way to hone yourself into that mindset every day.
Thank you. Questions out here? Online questions.
Guinevere would like to know, when did you start writing, and what compelled you to do so?
I mean, I've always written. Ever since I was a child, I got in trouble in middle school German class for trying to take notes. Like, I always had to take notes, and my German teacher was like, what could you possibly be writing down? This is a language class. We're learning how to write language. Stop writing. But there was always that urge, whether it be story or poetry, the urge to take notes and to try and process what I was learning and what I was thinking and what I was responding to through language has always been there. Poetry came later, though, and actually as a little bit of a surprise. My undergrad mentor was the one who kind of broke the news to me when I was applying to grad schools, and she had the contingency that she'd only write recommendation letters if I was also applying to poetry programs. But yeah, I feel like I really arrived at I didn't read a ton of poetry in high school either. I wrote really bad poetry, really god-awful, angsty high school poems, of course, but not in any serious way until undergrad and then after. well, it's what compelled me to. I don't know. I just, I guess it's sort of how I engage with the world. Like, I mean, Marilyn, you mentioned yesterday, like poets, we're all introverts. We don't really want to, we don't use our words in front of the microphone. They're all on the page, and that's where we engage. And I think that is true. Like poems or writing is sort of how I do engage with the world, despite otherwise being more shy and more reserved. It's always trying to find connections, trying to find narrative threads, trying to find ways of making sense, I suppose.
Trying to find ways of making sense. Underline that, double underline that. The question was, how does it?
Writing, and what propelled you to do that?
My family moved around a lot when I was a child, and so it was just us against the world. And so I didn't have a lot of friends. We were always new in the community, and books became a way of getting through life. So I started writing very early. And I think I started writing poems because of two things. One thing I recommend. My family had a set of books that was called Childcraft. And I've talked to so many adult poets who grew up with this Childcraft. You both nod, you know them.
We had some of those in our house.
Okay. They are about 12 volumes that are pieces of literature selected for children of a certain age group. So you get one is nursery rhymes and simple poems, and then there's longer poems. So I had that, and then my father kept, again, we were a military family, we moved around a lot. We didn't have a library. You can't move around a library. We had a piano. That was hard in itself, but one of the library books that came with us always was an introduction to poetry anthology that my father had in college. And it never got thrown away. It always came with us. And I read this book over and over again. I didn't know, because I had only seen these anthologies, these selected poems. I didn't know poets wrote books. I thought writing poetry meant writing a poem. And I'm not sure when I learned differently, but again, poetry's always been a part of my life.
I'll bring this microphone to you.
Thank you both so much. It's been really inspiring to see how many young people have been taking part in the festival. And Marilyn, you were talking last night about the difficulty, kind of growing difficulty of accessing that silence that you might need as a poet. And I think young people face unique challenges that maybe the rest of us haven't. And so I was just wondering if you, either of you or both of you, had advice that you would offer either a young aspiring poet or a young aspiring artist, what that advice might be.
I'm just remembering during the days when the kids all had earphones, they were all listening to a Walkman or something. I was in a restaurant, and there was a family sitting at a nearby table, and the mother said something to the children, and they were just, and she leaned over and pulled the earbud out of her son's ear to take the plug out and speak. This is a really serious problem in our culture that I don't know how to deal with. That what I find is the noise of the internet, the cell phone. It is so hard to escape it. Not literal noise, but brain noise. The first thing I do in the morning is reach for my cell phone and see. And I remember I had a friend who was a psychologist who said that this had already started happening to him way in the beginning of when Al Gore invented the internet. He said, the psychologist friend said, the first thing I do is check to see whether anybody is saying I'm wonderful. That's what I'm looking for. I want to read every morning somebody saying, you are wonderful. And I think when you just walk down a street, maybe it may not be as pervasive here because this is so strongly an intellectual community. But if you walk in most towns or cities, everybody's looking at their phone. You sit on a train. It used to be, I'm sorry, I'm getting carried away. I need to stop talking. But it used to be you would go on a trip someplace, a train trip. You're sitting next to somebody for 3 hours on a train, or in an airplane, even better. You wind up learning the story of this person's life. And at the end of the trip, you trade addresses and you send cards to each other for a couple of years. Does not happen anymore. In my experience, people don't start. Okay, I stop. I will not say anything else. Abby?
I think the takeaway here is the need to protect that space, and that's what I would though say that, the quote, the kids are all right, because I try a prompt very often that I think was from Bernadette Mayer. I borrowed it from a friend who borrowed it from a poet, and the exercise is to write down a track of images, like what do you remember from the time you left your house to where you're at now. And the idea was that very thing, that people were not paying attention to their surroundings. They were eyes glued to their phone, and the impossibility of producing 10 images that you actually witnessed from your door to your place because you weren't looking at anything, you were looking at your phone. And every time I've tried this exercise, my students have come up with more images than I do. And I'm the one that knows I'm going to assign this prompt. And so I think what I'm taking from that, though, is that if writing and art is something that matters in your life, and I say that matters in terms of something you want to actively participate in making, because there are many ways of engaging with art, but if making art and writing is something that matters, then you'll find the ways and time to do it, and protect those ways when you do find them. Protect the time that you can carve out, protect the silence, lean in. I mean, I got into a bad habit when I was working a really boring hourly job of scrolling through the news to kill time that wasn't sort of like, it wasn't really wasting time, and it wasn't really doing something that I wanted to be doing, but it also wasn't really doing the work that I was supposed to be doing, that I wasn't sure what it was. And I still do that. Like, I scroll through headlines and like not even good headlines. Like, I'll lean into the Yahoo News, like what's going on? Like, what's on fire now? And I'll give myself the moment to lean into that and be like, yep, I needed this mental break of levity and nonsense. And now I'm ready to put the phone away and go back to this work and to carve this work. And so, I think a complete discipline is unsustainable, but recognizing that it does take work and protection of that time and that silence. But you can also and should also enjoy life outside of the page, which is what I'm learning now with a toddler, is like, oh yes, there's more than just the page.
Here it comes.